Nice tie.
Thank you.
By the way, you sent Margot Lane to kill me.
Kill you? If I wanted you dead, Yinko, I would have your liver on the pole by now. I sent a girl to be killed. Tell me, how did you kill her?
She's alive.
And she's a danger to you. She now knows exactly who you are. How long will you let her live? How long before your pure instincts take over?
I'm onto your plan, Khan. You still don't have the beryllium sphere, and without it, you can't complete the bomb. Besides, you know I'm gonna stop you.
You Americans are so arrogant. You think your meaningless, decadent country is the new cradle of civilization. But let me tell you something.
That's the US of A you're talking about, pal.
I am talking about ruling the world.
I'd like to give you a name. Leonard Levinsky. Brilliant psychiatrist. You'll talk, he'll
are
listen.
boring me.
Oh, that knife.
Recognize it? I took it from the Toku. No, I correct myself. I took it out of the Toku after I ran it through his heart. When will you learn to listen to your instincts?
Instincts? I'll show you my instincts.
Never did master the purpose, did you? Still expected to respond to brute force. My Mongol warrior aren't terribly bright, but they are loyal. Accept the truth. There is no light without shadow, and you and I are their shadow. I would sooner destroy a Rembrandt than kill you. For the last time, will you join me? You cannot fool me. You cannot defeat me. Your mind is an open book to me.
Then learn how to read.
Weakling!
Tell him, Mo. Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Barry Constantine. And today we've got a new guest on who we've had some difficulty getting on, playing scheduling tag back and forth over the past few weeks. But we finally got you on, and that's Steven Honeycutt. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm a very busy man. No, just kidding. But maybe I am. I don't know. We'll see. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good too. And thanks for being accommodating with the different scheduling mishaps.
No worries, man. I know exactly where you're coming from.
So before we get started talking about today's movie, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
All right. My name is Steve Honeycutt. I'm a writer and actor based in LA. I just recently crowdfunded my own comic book, Escape to Earth, which is a very pulpy in its own way. There's dinosaurs and robots. There's no shadow type character. Maybe I'll get around to that someday if I can crowdfund another one. But yeah, it was pretty exciting to crowdfund that. And speaking of the shadow, he comes from the world of audio dramas. I also produced an audio drama podcast by the name of Ray Can't Sleep, which is about a burnt out musician who is trying to discover why he can't sleep, and he unearths this huge conspiracy. So if you like audio dramas, you might want to check it out.
And you said you're a writer too. So is your writing primarily comics, or what's your primary focus with writing stuff?
Well, I pretty much started with screenplays, and they were never really getting made and or getting sold, unless I made them. I haven't made a feature yet. A few turned into short films, and then I was just like, what am I going to do with these screenplays that are sitting on my hard drive, gathering digital dust? So one of them became the comic book that got crowdfunded. And Ray Can't Sleep. I wrote it in screenplay format, but it was always supposed to be an audio drama. So yeah, I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but I'd love to get back to feature writing and hopefully producing one someday, trying to work back up to it, basically.
Yeah. Screenwriting is just one of those things that's such a difficult thing to break into, and just like and making it yourself, producing it yourself. It's such a Herculean task. Even comic books, right? Even with crowdfunding and all that, it's still so many moving parts, so many different things to juggle, which is one of the reasons why I've mostly done novels, because it's just me I got to worry about.
Ooh, that's I'd like to talk to you about that, because that's what I've sort of thought about jumping into that that sort of genre as well. But I don't know, someday. How many have you written?
I think the one that just came out today actually is number 30, I believe.
Wow, so you're 30 novels?
Yeah.
That is amazing. What do you write?
Oh, so me, mostly these days I'm doing urban fantasy, but I've also done I've done superheroes, I've done some pulpy stuff, some action adventure stuff, and but yeah, mostly these days I've been doing urban fantasy stuff.
Do you have a shadow analog in your novels?
No, I do not actually. I do have a character. I do have a character that is kind of a shadow analog that's been talking about burning digital dust. I do have a concept, and I've done like a little short story about a character like that, but haven't turned it into anything as of yet. So, but we'll see what happens with
that. Well, hey, you should, if you haven't, you should consider the world of audio books or audio drama. Just take your novel and put in a bunch of sound effects and stuff. Of course, it ain't easy. I did it all myself. But it is doable. Sounds are free, and voice actors are a dime a dozen, baby. And I can say that because I am one. So, yeah.
I've had a few of them produced into audiobooks.
Nice.
Back when Audible had their they still do their royalty share program, where you and the voice actor, you split the royalties, but it's but they cut like the royalty share, they cut that in half, like the amount of royalties you can get. So it used to be, when they first started, you could easily find a voice actor who's willing to do the royalty split, but now it's a lot harder. So now you got to pay up front for the production costs.
That's how it goes, right?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I did have two of my urban fantasy books got optioned by Tantor, but they haven't said anything about the rest of the series.
Sweet.
Yeah, but that's the problem. Like, once they option those, then it's tough to produce any more with that series, because I can't get the same actor and all that kind of stuff. So
right. I hear you.
But anyway, so, and I can see from your background there. So people who are listening, you can't see this, but I see Steve's got like a bunch of Ultra Force action figures. He's got I think that's Grifter from Wildcats, some trade paperbacks up there. So obviously you're a nerd, and so I want to talk to you about what was kind of your entry point into this world.
Oh man, well, back in the 90s, that's when we moved, and I basically got introduced to, I found out that there was a shop that only sells comics. Like before that, I was just buying them off the rack. My parents sort of introduced me. They weren't nerds or geeks in the slightest. Like, my mom maybe read Archie or something. I remember, if I begged her enough in the grocery store, she would get me an Archie double digest. And I was so little, I didn't even, if there's any jokes in Archie comics, I wasn't even getting them back then. But I was just like, hey, this is colorful, this is fun, it reminds me of cartoons. And then of course, Batman 89 came out, and that was a huge deal. And I would say if it weren't for Batman 89, you and I wouldn't even be talking about the Shadow right now. But I mean, no, like full on nerddom, if you want to call that, came with my introduction to the comic shop world in the 90s, because I didn't even know that there was such a thing as independent comics at that point. I knew Marvel. I knew about Marvel mostly because the school library had actually these little hardbound collections of Marvel comics. There was one for Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Captain America, and I forgot the fourth one, Daredevil. And I remember me and my friends, we would all just check them out and sort of trade them amongst ourselves and stuff, and see who could grab it. And then eventually made my way to buying them off the rack, and then the comic shop world, where this crazy new company called Image was exploding onto the scene. I was probably too young for it, but hey, that's what the big kids were into, so I was going to be into it too. Like, I got into the world of Youngblood and Wildcats and all that stuff. And even though I was like, what, $2.50 for a comic? Are you out of your mind? Because like before that, they were all like $1, and then got into Valiant, and and then of course during the 90s, you also had like sort of the first wave of comic book movies again because of Batman 89. I loved The Rocketeer. I loved Dick Tracy, even though I'd never read like Dick Tracy comic strip in my entire life. Anything with like trench coats and like guns and action, like I was all on board for. And I mean, I remember seeing The Phantom in the theater as well. And I was listening to your episode on that, and it treaded a lot of similar territory that I think you and I are going to be treading tonight. So I actually had to stop. I was like, oh, I don't want to rip this guy off. So yeah, I mean, I guess long answer to your question is finding a comic shop in the 90s, basically.
Yeah, I think that's how most of us got in, because or through like, I mean, for me it was like the animated series and stuff like that. Like Batman, we had Batman 89, we had Superman the movie, so those were like always part of my life. Like I don't remember a time where I did not know about those movies, right? Because I'd watched them so young. But then it was like, Batman the animated series came out right after Batman Returns, which was huge, and then the X-Men and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually finding when you were talking about the grocery store and stuff, I was having flashbacks to my own time when whenever I'd go to the grocery store with my my parents or my grandmother, and they'd just be like, all right, fine, just stay here in the comics section and just read comics while I take care do what I have to do.
Oh yeah, and I would say it's because of the magazine section in the grocery store, which definitely helped fuel my sort of obsession with the Shadow movie when it came out. Because I remember, I think, what was the big one? Starlog. I think Starlog and Fangoria were all published by the same publisher, and they would come out with movie specials. And I remember I wouldn't buy it at first. I would just go in and read the Shadow movie special magazine over and over again. Eventually I bought it, and I'm pretty sure I still have it sitting amongst my comics in my one section of my comics in my my mom's attic, and I'm sure it's pretty sure it's still there in mint condition, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I first found out about this movie from also through comics, but through like because all the comic books back then in the like 93, 94, they all had advertisements for the Shadow movie.
Oh man, I missed those. Yeah.
So obviously we're talking about 1994's The Shadow, and just the whole idea of it. And like, because I love superheroes, love Batman and all that kind of stuff. So I just love the fact that we had, a new superhero movie. I don't know anything about this. And this was actually the first, like, some connection that my dad had with stuff. Cause like, well, wait, The Shadow? Cause he had listened to the radio show when he was a kid. So that's how he knew about that. And when I was showing him the images and stuff, he's like, no, the Shadow doesn't wear a costume. He's just invisible. And I'm just like, yeah, but he wears a costume in the movie. And I found out, later doing research, that in the pulps he had the costume, but in the radio show he was just invisible the whole time.
Right. Yeah, I never got a chance to watch. There's a Shadow serial as well, and I think he dons the costume in that, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. The radio show is, yeah, he's just a voice basically.
Yeah.
I also feel like I'll just say straight up, like all of my knowledge about the Shadow comes from well, aside from this movie, the radio show and the run of Dynamite comics, which are really great. I don't know if you ever read them, but they're
Is that the one?
awesome.
I think Garth Ennis did that.
He was involved with. There's like a couple of different series. They like there was like a regular Shadow ongoing. There was one that they called the Shadow Now, where it's like him in current day. They were doing a lot of stuff with the Shadow for a while there. I think it was like early 2000s, maybe 2010, I think. And they were doing a lot of stuff with a bunch of different pulps, which I'm 100% for, because like, I mean, I don't know about you, but you can only read so many like Batman and X-Men stories to where you're like, yeah, what else is out there? You know, at least that's what I'm always asking. I'm always asking what else is out there, like in the world of like comics or movies or whatever. And but yeah, like, and that is the one weird, like the characterization of the Shadow in the radio show compared to the one in the movie is pretty different. I've never read the pulps. I'm actually in a Shadow Facebook group, and yeah, I was told that if I really want to get the real deal, I should read the pulps. One of these days I will. Just haven't gotten around to it yet.
Yeah. I've pretty much my only firsthand association with the Shadow is really from this movie. Like I've never read any of the comics. No, I did listen when the movie came out. My library, they had a bunch of the radio show episodes on cassette, and I had checked a few of those out, and I'd listened to a few of them, but that was so long ago that I don't really have much memory of it anymore. But mostly it comes from the movie and just like secondhand research, like just, you know, hearing about people talk about it. When I first started getting into writing and publishing, I did a lot of work with a lot of independent pulp publishers, and I still do occasionally. So there's a lot of like I found out about the Shadow and Doc Savage, John Carter and all that through my association with those guys. And and yeah, one of the things, like I love Batman, I love the X-Men, I love seeing new stories with them, don't get me wrong, but I also think it's cool to see people taking these other characters, especially like a lot of these public domain characters, and giving them a new lease on life in comics, in novels and short stories. And it sucks when you have some of these characters like the Shadow or Doc Savage or the Avenger, who are the rights are still owned by someone, and those people aren't really doing a whole lot with those rights.
Yeah, it's a shame, for sure.
So yeah, but when I was really excited about this movie as a kid, and then I don't think I'd actually watched it in the theater. I think I'd actually rented it when it came out on video. And when I saw it, I was just kind of like, oh, okay, that was a movie, and I never really thought much about it since then. But then I had rewatched it a few years ago, and you may have heard this, and people who would listen to that episode remember me talking when we did the Phantom. There was like this weird pulp revival period of the pulps in the 90s in movies and TV, because they had they were starting to get popular because of stuff like Batman, and so superheroes were starting to get more popular in the mainstream, but they didn't really have the budgets to do the big mainstream superheroes that everyone knew about. But the pulps, they're just basically regular guys in masks, so it was a lot easier to handle. And so you had a lot of these studios buying up these different properties back then. And the three big ones were really you had the Shadow, you had the Phantom, and like you mentioned, the Rocketeer. And of those, I think, the Rocketeer, undoubtedly the best one. It still holds up today.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Such a well-made movie, such a brilliant movie, such a brilliant use of the time period. It really, very much like the Indiana Jones movies, it sets it in that period without making it feel like kishy or something like that, right? It feels really, it feels like an accurate representation of that time period while still managing to be a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the reason why The Rocketeer probably stands out among the other two that you said, it's just because that script is just iron tight, it's
Mhm.
ironclad. Like it's so good. Um, I think pretty much all three of them kind of bombed, right? Right out of the gate almost.
I'm not sure about the Rocketeer. I think the Rocketeer did pretty decently. If
Mhm.
I'm not 100% sure though.
So while I'm thinking about it, did you watch the Disney animated Rocketeer where it's like a little girl?
No, I haven't, but I am looking forward to, once my daughter gets a little bit older, I'm looking forward to having her be able to watch that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I gotcha. But yeah, those yeah, I think it's Indiana Jones was huge, Batman did huge. Yeah, so I can imagine all the other studios were like, well, what else we got? Like who else
Mhm.
can we get? And so yeah, they got the Shadow and the Fan. Although, you say that, they're just regular guys in masks. However, it was they really, I mean, there was a lot of visual effects in the Shadow
There
movie. I
were,
mean,
yeah,
it
yeah.
it was so expensive looking.
Mhm.
Like just and they had and plus, I mean, you got the director, Russell Mulcahy,
Mhm.
who is the director of Highlander, a very visual director. And watching this, it almost feels like, and I don't know if you've seen the movie, and I think you may have even done an episode about it, which is why when you were asking for guests, I didn't even bring it up. You've seen Sam Raimi's Dark Man,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. We done an
Well,
episode of that fairly
the
recently.
reason why he made up Darkman is because he couldn't get the rights to the Shadow.
Yeah, yeah.
And this feels like it was directed by Sam Raimi
Mhm. Mhm.
sometimes, like just a lot of the way, like when they did the this is one of the many, like I have it written down in my notes, like it's just a bunch of kind of stuff that they just piled on that I didn't think really needed to be in there. When they showed like the tube, like they put a little note and the tube goes all over the city and stuff, like that was just so needlessly expensive. Like we didn't even need to
Mhm.
see it. And the way it was going all over the place just reminded me very much of Sam Raimi's style. I almost, and it's weird because this is a Universal picture, and Sam Raimi was with Universal for a long time
Mhm.
when he was going through Darkman and Hercules. I just wonder if he like maybe wasn't even available for some reason, and they were like, "Well, who else we got?" It's like,
No, I think
well,
it
we got the
was,
hot.
if I'm remembering my history correctly, like because Darkman came out before this, came out in
Yeah.
1990,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
and when Sam Raimi was interested in doing The Shadow, that was around that time period, and they thought he wasn't. They're like, no, this guy, he can't do it. This is too big of a property. This is too much
Hmm.
potential to give it to the director of the Evil Dead trilogy.
Oh, so they
Um,
gave it to the director of the Highlander trilogy. Well, the
right,
first two Highlanders.
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
I get it.
yeah, and they also had a similar problem because he had also wanted to do Batman too after Burton left. And so he had approached
Hmm.
Warner Brothers about revamping the Batman franchise, and they had the same reaction. They're like, we're not going to hire the guy who did Evil Dead. No, we're not going to put him in a Batman movie. And then after
And
that,
that's
he does
probably.
Spider Man, and then everyone's like, oh fuck, we probably should have hired him.
Oh, I thought you were going to say after that he went and created Mantis. Can't leave out
That too,
Mantis.
yeah, yeah, you're right. But and Mantis that's another interesting one because you watch that pilot and you compare it to the TV show. Like the pilot is so much more steeped in the pulps as
Oh,
opposed to the
it's
TV
so
show.
pulpy. Like
Mhm.
even like there's because I forgot to mention at the top, I also do another podcast called Obscurity Now, where we look at stuff that we consider to be like almost forgotten by
Mhm.
at least the normies in the world. And we did an episode on Mantis, and yeah, just I mean I remember watching that when it premiered on TV back in the day because I would watch anything related to superheroes no matter what, and like it was so Shadow-esque. Like there was a couple times where he just used his mask for the mind control, which they never did in the TV series. And yeah, it was just this was Sam Raimi doing his like once again his Batman mixed with something else, so maybe mixed with a bit of Shadow, called Mantis. But yeah, like yeah, the Shadow seemed like it was very expensive to make.
Mhm.
Like I just yeah, they weren't cutting any corners. I mean, of course they were, it seemed like mostly they were hanging out on the Universal backlot a lot of the time for a lot of the exteriors and stuff. But and also I felt like a lot of the time the visual representation of his powers like doesn't really make sense, because the way the Shadow's powers works is that like he's clouding your mind so you can't see him. So when they show him like walking around, like his footsteps in the water, like that doesn't make any sense, because that makes it say that he's actually like an invisible man, a guy who has the power of actual invisibility. So just that, I mean, I just thought that was just one of the flaws of the movie, is that they couldn't really kind of figure out exactly what his like power set was at the time.
That's a good point. And I never even, there was something off to me when I was rewatching it, like when he's in that scene with Tim Curry and he's, in the water, and they could see his feet in the water, because they make a point of mentioning in the, like, I understood it when they had it, the Mongols saw his shadow, because they make that point in the opening text scroll that, his shadow is the only thing he can't hide. And I'm like, okay, it's corny, but it makes sense. So, that's the rules we're establishing. And then you're right. They had the footsteps, they had the water, and that doesn't make sense. He doesn't physically turn invisible. So that was,
Right.
And I was watching, I'm like, this feels really weird for some reason, but I don't know why. Then talking about the effects of this movie I was actually kind of surprised how much some of the effects hold up. Like, because I remember watching this as a kid, and I remember the knife, the knife with the teeth and everything. I remember being kind of freaked out about that as a kid, and rewatching it now.
I hated that knife. I'm like, why is the knife alive? I mean, I must have been, I don't know, 10, 11 watching this in the theater. And, I was already, hooked in by the magazine and, all the marketing hype and everything. So, but even I at that age was like, why is the knife alive? And this is what leads, like, for a lot of the visuals and stuff, I was getting Highlander 2 vibes in the way that I feel like the director, Russell Mulcahy, who I actually love. I love Highlander 1 and some of his other work. And, he also directed Highlander 2. You've seen Highlander 2, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. I just feel like that's one where just like he and whatever producers are involved just got a big like mound of coke, and they're just like, what crazy crap can we put in this movie that doesn't make any sense? And that was the talking knife. But I guess to play sort of devil's advocate, in the Shadow Facebook group that I'm in, apparently that knife thing is actually from one of the pulp novels or something like that. And I was like, that's fine. Still didn't need to be in there. It really didn't need to be in there. Or at least they could have had it in there. Doesn't need to be alive, doesn't need to be alive.
Yeah. The one thing about it, though, is I was surprised how well those effects actually held up, because I had very strong memories of that knife. And when I sat down to watch this movie last night, I'm like, oh, I bet that knife is going to look like shit now. And it actually didn't. It still looked pretty decent.
It did look good. You know what else it reminded me of? Remember how in the Mortal Kombat movie, how Scorpion's little like spear thing was also alive? You remember that? Like,
yeah.
What producer is like, we got to bring these weapons to life, baby?
That was a weird choice. Yeah, and that movie is an example of CGI that doesn't hold up, because I remember Reptile from that movie and just looking
right
absolutely god awful now.
Still a better movie than the new Mortal Kombat, but that's
absolutely,
podcast.
absolutely, yeah. I'll defend that original Mortal Kombat movie to my grave, but not so much Annihilation, but that's also another story.
Right, sure.
But yeah, I mean, the effects in this looked really good. I was really kind of surprised how well they hold up, because especially for a movie at that time, because these movies weren't really taken seriously. And another thing that's funny is, when I was talking about comparing it to the Rocketeer and the Phantom and the Shadow of those three, it's definitely the bottom of the barrel of those three movies. Rocketeer, obviously, and the Phantom is like this weird kind of blend of the two of them. It feels like it's well, some of the people are taking it seriously. Like Billy Zane is taking it pretty seriously. He's pretty committed to it. Catherine Zeta-Jones is taking it pretty seriously. And then you got Treat Williams and Lesser Buffy, just like, completely terrible.
Christy Swanson.
Christy Swanson, that was it. Yeah, I just call her Lesser
Well,
Buffy because I can
what
never
do
remember
you-
her name.
Right. What do you mean by the shadow is the bottom of the barrel compared to those other two? I'm just.
I think
what do
the
you mean by that?
shadow, because even though it's got some really good effects, I feel like it doesn't seem to take itself as seriously as the material needs to be. It feels like it's a bit too tongue in cheek, and I think a big part of that came from the fact that David Coep, the screenwriter, was a big fan of the radio show, and he was trying to kind of mimic the style and the tone of the radio show, which doesn't really work in 1994. I mean,
I don't. It's been a while since I've listened. I mean, the radio show wasn't very jokey, though, was it? It seemed.
I don't know.
It was
Like
pretty
I,
serious.
like I said, I don't really have much of a memory. I just read that in on IMDb that was one of his things. He wanted to make it similar to the same tone as the radio show, as opposed to the darker tone of the pulps.
See, I would say that he was probably the positive force, like the things that are good about the movie. And I imagine there was producers breathing down his neck to add in more comedic elements. Like the stuff that I could feel sort of like the studio like forcing into the movie are things like, okay, because there is an interesting sort of line you got there. Like,
Yeah.
you can tell he wants it to be serious because there's a lot of casual death and violence in this. I was so surprised. I was like, when Shawan Khan makes the cab driver just drive his car into like a gas tank and blow up, and then he makes another guy put a gun to his head and like blow his head off. I think that was like, I was just like, wow, like you're never gonna see that in any MCU movie. Like nobody dies in those movies. Like if they do, it's way off camera. You never see it. So, and I think that at least in in terms of pulp tone, like that is that's where you want to be. But then when you get stuff like I mean, I love Tim Curry, man, but he was in there to be a comic relief, and he went pretty over the top, like especially there was a scene where Shawan Khan again, and I think John Lone is great as Shawan Khan. Like he always does great as sadly the Asian villain. I'd love to see him just play like I mean, I don't even know if he's still, I'm pretty sure he's still alive.
He's still alive. Yeah. I checked last night because when I was doing research for it, and it's weird because IMDb, they have got this really old picture of him, which usually is a sign that the actor has died. So I was really kind of surprised when I looked into it, found out, no, he's still alive, but he hasn't made anything in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing him like one of the last ones he was in that I remember is like The Transporter, where of course he played the Asian villain, and he was looking pretty old then, and that was like what, 20 years ago. So yeah, I'm pretty sure he's retired. Too bad. I mean, he was great, but whatever, he had a great run. But yeah, anyway, he was yelling at his thugs, which I also have comments about them as well, to go and get the shadow. Basically, they're like, go get him. And like Tim Curry, I think he was like, ooh, should I go too? Or is this like just something like cheesy and very sort of Disney-esque? And I was just like, that doesn't, like, it would have been so much better if they would have, I'm sure David Coep, if he really is a fan of the shadow, wanted to make it as serious as if he could have made it as serious as he wanted to, it probably would have been a lot better. That's just my theory. Yeah,
probably. Yeah. Now, a few things you said there. Like one of the things. Now you make a good point with the violence and all that, and the death, and that's true. But I think one thing that the MCU does that I think this movie doesn't is it feels like the performances are taking it a little bit more seriously and they're a little bit more earnest. I feel like there's a lot of camera winking, especially with Alec Baldwin's performance in this.
But I feel that in both. I mean, in the MCU and this. Like, I mean, I guess pre-Disney MCU, there wasn't that much camera winking. But now, to me, it all feels like ever since Guardians of the Galaxy, it's all been camera winking, especially in the, your Thor Ragnaroks and your Love and Thunder and stuff like that. But no, yeah, you're absolutely right. Alec Baldwin he's hamming it up, but I'm enjoying his performance in this. I mean, it would have been better again, like, I mean, if you can imagine like the Christopher Nolan version of The Shadow, it would probably be a million times better. Like everyone would be taking it super seriously, might even be too serious. But this is, years before that. So, I mean, what do you think of Alec Baldwin's performance as The Shadow?
It's weird because on paper, Alec Baldwin seems like he'd be a great fit for this character. And I know that David Coet felt like that too. Like he had written the script actually with Baldwin in mind. But and it's hard to think about Alec Baldwin now because I so associate him with 30 Rock and his more comedic stuff now.
Well, I'm glad you said 30 Rock and not him accidentally shooting someone.
Oh.
I probably shouldn't have brought that up, but too late. You can edit that out if you want.
Actually, my wife did mention that when I was watching this last night. She's like, who's that? I'm like, oh, that's Alec Baldwin. Then she brought up the shooting thing, and I'm like, didn't he shoot someone on set? I'm like, yeah, that happened.
Now I have a question for you, since you and I are probably the only ones watching The Shadow in 2022. When he turns into the Shadow in the costume, like, does his face change too? Like it's so weird. Like I feel like there's like some sort of there's like a stunt man or something. Like, do you get what I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah, there's something really weird about the way he looks in the costume. I almost feel like his nose is too big or something. I don't know what it is exactly.
Well, I think they were really trying to capture like the regular Shadow look, which is a dude with a big nose. And and I was just like, I'm like, how are you explaining this? Like, which is the real version? Is Alec Baldwin like the real I forgot what's the Shadows? Lamont Cranston. Like, is Lamont Cranston the real guy, or is the Shadow the real guy? Like, you could actually really like get into some deep, psychology here or something, or were they just like really desperate to try to capture that Shadow look to where they were just like going with it? And again, the cocaine was probably flowing, and that's like one thing that I kind of do like about this movie, because it's obviously pre Christopher Nolan, and so there's a lot of stuff that they're just going with, like. Why does Shawan Khan's thugs, like, why are they wearing samurai armor? Like, I mean, where would they get it? Like, why do they need to wear it? Like, why can't they just dress like in normal 1940s clothes? And the answer is because this is a pulp movie, and like that's probably what they would have done back in like the Serial, basically. And you just sort of have to go with it. Like, another thing that I feel like was kind of forced upon David Coep was like, okay, so you really have to suspend your disbelief here. Okay, so we've got our main protagonist, who is basically you could say a mentalist or telepath, basically. And then his main villain shows up, and again, why does he have to show up in a coffin? Like, why can't he?
I was thinking that too. I couldn't understand why he needed to do that.
You just have to go with it, so now we've got two, powerful mentalists or telepaths who have to like fight each other. But then throwing in even more disbelief is, oh, look at this, a random woman that I've never met before. Oh, she also has the ability to be a telepath. And it's just like, is everyone a freaking telepath in the Shadow universe? And in the radio show, Margot Lane was definitely not a telepath as far as I can remember.
Right.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and never in the comics that I read. And I mean, I understand that, they probably beefed up her part, because like this whole thing is like, just dudes fighting each other for the most part. So they wanted to have a strong female lead. What do you think about Penelope Ann Miller's performance in this as Margot Lane?
I mean, she does decently with what she's given. Problem is what she's given isn't that great, but like,
right.
Again, if you compare it to Kristy Swanson in The Phantom, where she was given a lot more material and she's terrible in it. So I think with what Penelope Ann Miller was given here, she did decent enough with it. Right. Yeah, the whole telepathy angle just doesn't seem to really serve much of a purpose, right? It
Right.
doesn't really. It's just like a reason for Lamont to have some sort of interest in her in the first place, and
Right. Like, why can't they just be boyfriend and girlfriend? Just because.
right, yeah.
And also, like, if she, I mean, and that was one of the fun
Well,
things
also
I
too,
liked
it
about.
also kind of stretches the credulity of it, because we're this mysterious woman who suddenly shows up in town. She also happens to be a telepath, and oh yeah, her father can build an atomic bomb, and he's going to be the like. I think we're pushing the coincidences too far then.
Yeah, it's too much. It was too much, and I could see, a lot of people, even probably the hardcore Shadow fans at the time, were probably just like, this is too much for me to deal with. I don't know. I felt like she, again, probably not her fault, but felt like she didn't really have a lot of range, at least in this performance. It was all just sort of a little over the top all the time, and it kind of annoyed me a bit. Like, I don't remember being that annoyed when I first watched it, but like watching it here in 2022, I was like, man, like, no wonder we haven't really heard from her in a long time.
Yeah.
Again, I mean, I would say, yeah, I mean, I haven't watched The Phantom in a while, but yeah, probably better than Christy Swanson. Maybe they're both hanging out right now. I haven't
Maybe,
seen
yeah. Well, I don't know.
talking
Christy
about
Swanson has become like a Trump fanatic now, so I don't think she's hanging out with much of
well.
anyone. She's gone the Kevin Sorbo, Dean Cain route.
Oh man, yeah, we talk about both of those guys quite a bit on Obscurity now. But yeah, I mean, including the original Hercules TV movie. But anyway, yeah, like, and that was like their dynamic, like whenever they're like on screen together, it just doesn't work. For me, at least. They're annoying together. And it would, again, like, if you had maybe more of, I mean, again, I don't want to say if you would have had more of a visionary director, because Russell Mulcahy at his peak was very visionary or visual. Maybe if it had more of Sin City vibe, like, taken more seriously, like you said, it would have been, I mean, it would have been a completely different movie, and maybe more successful. Like, who knows?
Yeah, I think they were trying to, because this came out in after Batman Returns, but before Batman Forever. So it's in this period when I think studios don't really know what the line is, because
right.
Batman Returns had pushed things too far for audiences' taste at that time, and Batman Forever hadn't come out yet, which had taken things complete. So this is in this weird kind of like, we're trying to see how we could make something that's semi-dark with some over-the-top comedic elements to kind of water it down a little bit.
Right. It's like when Disney tries to go dark and you get Black Widow, which is an absolutely terrible movie. I hope you agree.
Somewhat. Like, I it's not my favorite of the MCU movies, but I don't think any, like, none of the MCU movies are actually, I don't think any of them are actually terrible. Even the one I hated the most was Iron Man 3, but after doing an episode on that, I kind of had some shifts in opinion on that.
See, I like that one as a Shane Black movie. I am a Shane Black fan. I never read an Iron Man. Like, I read like maybe a reprint of the original Iron Man. I was never an Iron Man fan, never read the comics. So when that movie came out and it was like good, like, I was just blown away. But that's a tangent.
We can go back and listen to the episode we did with a few guys on that, and the Shane Black of it was kind of like my biggest issue with it, because it felt more of a Shane Black movie and less of an Iron Man movie.
100%.
Yeah. And if you like that sort of thing, yeah, more power to you. But that's, and
right.
As much as I love Shane Black, that was a situation where I felt like the director was putting his own style and is above the adaptation side of things.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and that's how I feel about post Disney MCU, is that they just go in there and do whatever they want now. They don't really respect the material too much. It's why you end up with the task, like weird female taskmaster who is not the taskmaster like in the slightest from the comics.
I did not like that. I will agree with you on that. I did not like that aspect of it.
But backing up to Iron Man 3, everyone was so mad about the Mandarin, and I was just like, I don't care. But again, that's because I didn't really read. I mean, I remember watching the cartoon. I remember the Mandarin, but I was just like, I guess if you don't have a nostalgia for certain things, then you don't care. And
no, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the Guardians movies is a good example of that, because I had very little familiarity with the Guardians comic books, but Star-Lord in the movies completely different from what he was in the comics.
I actually,
whereas but also and that's because I wasn't a Guardians fan, but then you compare it to something like Moon Knight, which we had just had done an episode of that fairly recently. I was a lot more critical of Moon Knight because I love those comics.
Right. I mean, I try to look at these things as a movie critic and a comic book fan and see if it succeeds in any way. And most lately, like, Disney's just been failing in my eyes for the most part. But anyway, guess we should get back to the Shadow here.
You can listen to what I said about Iron Man 3, because I definitely had conflicting opinions when we did that episode. But yeah, with the Shadow, one other thing that really kind of bugged me with this movie, and this kind of connects to what you were saying before about the clouding men's minds things, is that the telepathy in this is not really portrayed with any sort of real consistency, because a lot of times it seems like Lamont Cranston is capable of just reading people's minds, but then other times he needs to question people and ask them for information. So I can't understand why.
Well, I mean, I think the way they sort of handled that in the radio show and the comics is basically like, some people's minds are stronger than others. But yeah, I mean, I definitely hear what you're saying. What I don't get is that by the end of the movie, he gets full on like telekinesis and was like, he like throws shards of glass at Shawan Khan and is like, that's not the Shadow. Like the Shadow is not Batman either. To me, the characterization of the Shadow in like the comics and the radio shows is that he's more of a almost like a Doctor Strange type. He's like the smartest guy. He doesn't need to resort to fighting because he's already smarter than you for the most part. He just sort of like, he doesn't even have to do this, but he puts his hand to his forehead and he's like, oh, you don't even see me. You're going to tell me everything I want to know, then you're going to drop your gun and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure like the studio execs were like, oh, no, he's got to beat up someone. And, of course when he comes up against other people who he can't control their mind, then he has to resort to his awesome guns and everything. But yeah, like watching the Shadow, like knowing what I know about the Shadow now and watching him like fight some thugs, I'm just like, why is he fighting them? Why isn't he just using his ability to cloud their minds? And like the Shadow in the radio show or comic would just make the thugs fight each other, or basically. So
and it's weird that they don't explain that, because there's a lot of exposition in this movie. Like almost too much, because like there's that one scene when he's with his uncle and his uncle's like, I've never meddled in your affairs, not even after the war when you were disappeared for 7 years, and he's very specific about it.
Right.
So they have all these expository scenes, but they never really have an exposition explaining how the telepathy works. And I guess I wonder if part of that is just because we don't want to explain it, because we don't want people to think too much about it.
Well, I mean, if you're going to go that route, like why even explain his origin? Like, I mean, of course, again, as we said, like this was my introduction to the character. And I guess this is the origin in the radio show too, where they're just like, oh, he was a bad guy who, very similar to Doctor Strange, like went to Tibet and, learned all these, wacky mystical powers. Because I guess, that was just, that was sort of like the trend back in like the 40s and 50s, is that, Tibet is like the source of all this mystical power and stuff, because a lot of people didn't travel as much back then. So
Right.
if someone comes back and they're like, "Ooh, I learned how to cloud men's minds thanks to this Tibetan monk," they're like, "Oh, really? Tell me
Yeah, yeah.
more." So so yeah, like I could have just lived without having the whole origin part at the beginning. Like, and again, that's why like I was almost taken aback when I was watching it, because nowadays, I guess depending on who you're watching, if it's Disney or Warner Brothers, Disney especially, they're basically family films now. Before I felt like they were action comedies. Now they're more like family films. And Doctor Strange, he's not even allowed to go to Tibet because they can't acknowledge Tibet, because then they can't sell the film in China and all this other stuff. And this movie opens up and you've got freaking Lamont Cranston in an opium den surrounded by prostitutes and stuff, like, which is the way the pulp should be. Like, yeah, you're just not going to get that here in 2022. That's too offensive.
Well, I think one of the reasons why they had that origin in there, because it was originally supposed to play a bigger part in the finale. So originally, when they're going through the Hall of Mirrors, that was supposed to be a much longer sequence. And Khan was going to be taunting Cranston by showing images from his past on the mirrors from when he was Yinko. But there was an earthquake and it destroyed the set, and the filmmakers, they ran out of time and they ran out of money, so they couldn't do the scene as they had originally planned to do it. So the entire connection between the opening scene when he's Yinko and he's a bad guy, and the end is just gone now. So now it just feels very extraneous, that
rushed. Oh yeah, that makes so much sense, because the end felt very rushed. Like they didn't have a really good just final battle, like in the slightest. It was all just a bunch of effects basically. And I mean, if you think about it, like what happens in that fight? Like Shawan Khan uses his telepathy or telekinesis to throw the knife at him, and then he stops the knife like with his hands, and I guess he remembers his Jedi training or whatever, and then basically turns the knife back on him, plus he throws a bunch of shards of like mirror. And yeah, it all feels very rushed, very cocaine inspired. And yeah, I mean, I think I remember even back then, when I first watched it, I was like, I have no idea what's going on in this end here, and it just felt very unsatisfying. Like what I feel like would have been, I mean, what you described to me sounded great. Like, they could have gone at each other with their like mentalism skills and get at a stalemate, and then resort to like fisticuffs and like the Shadow can beat him that way. And that would have been better than what we got.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest failings is that I think this movie is trying too hard to be Batman light. Whereas 100%. if you look at the Shadow, and like I know in the radio show they had simplified his origin so that he was just Lamont Cranston, but in the pulps he was actually a different guy altogether. Lamont Cranston was another guy, and the Shadow just assumed his identity at times and used his resources. And like the Shadow is actually more like Moon Knight, where he's got all these different identities he assumes. I think doing something like that would have been a lot more interesting, but I think the studio they wanted something
Bruce Wayne. Yeah,
right.
Basically.
Yeah.
I remember when after I saw it, I went into my local comic shop in Williamsburg, Virginia, and of course, like the comic book shop owner, he was much older, at least much older to me. He was probably really only in his like late 20s, early 30s at the time. And I was like, so what did you think of the Shadow? And he's like, I didn't like it. They made him too much like Bruce Wayne. And I'm just like, oh, well, whatever you say. But he was 100% right. I mean, again, I, didn't have the relationship with the Shadow then that I do now. But yeah, he was 100% correct.
Yeah. And I think that's probably a big reason why this movie didn't really find any success, is that people went to see it and they're like, well, it's kind of like Batman, but it's like a low rent version of Batman, so I don't really like it then.
Right. If it would have just they could have just let David Coep like do his thing, like, it probably would have been a lot better. I just had like a thought, like, remember in the early 2000s when like 300 and the Spirits like were sort of all those really heavily stylized ultraviolet. I think that's when like Watchmen came out. They should have done a shadow then. Like that would have been interesting. Like let Zack Snyder have a shot at him. I mean, the old Zack Snyder. I don't know about the new one where he's using all these like dumb lenses and stuff to film zombies. I don't know about that, but the Zack Snyder from 300, I'd like to see him take a crack at the Shadow.
Yeah, I think the Shadow would be a character that's so much more suited to Snyder's sensibilities and like his views on heroism and superheroes, because you look at his DC movies and it's just like, motherfucker really just doesn't really like superheroes. So maybe you should give him more of these pulp characters.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see like a pulp revival, and maybe some of these other characters could take a little break for a while. Like, I mean, do we need another Thor movie? I mean,
I actually just saw the latest one today, and for me, I'm on board for more Thor movies.
I mean, I haven't seen it. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of Ragnarok because I thought it was too jokey. And I didn't get, when you were mentioning the Guardians of the Galaxy, I mean, I was the one guy who read like the Guardians of the Galaxy run that basically sort of made them a thing again. It was,
you mean the Abnett and Lanning run?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And have you read that one?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it was so good. And it was humorous, but it was still like serious, and the plot was serious and the threat was serious, where, I mean, I just, Guardians of the Galaxy to me was just, I'm like, why is there a mixtape with all this mom music on it? And I just, like, there was too many jokes, like, oh, look at that, he thinks he's invisible if he doesn't move, ha 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 ha. So that's just not what I want in a superhero movie. That's just my own personal opinion.
Fair enough. It's not for everybody. I will say though that it was the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. They ended up making my wife into a fan of superhero movies. When is before that, she would not touch them with a 10-foot pole.
Well, sure, they're great for non-comic book readers, I'd say. For the normies, if you want to call them that. But yeah, I mean, it was what it was.
But with the Shadow, it's. What do you think of the Brooks Brothers conversation?
Oh yeah, that was when I started to cringe, as the kids say. Like, I was like, what? Like, all right, so now because it felt like, I think up until then, stuff was feeling pretty serious. And even though he's like, Shawan Khan shows up in a coffin, like, I was still going with it. Like, he's the villain, whatever. And then, they do that. And then when they shoot the bullets at each other and they both, like, that was so dumb. Even back then, I was like, all right, I get that this is a pulp world, but like, why is that shot even in there to show that they're evenly matched? It's like they didn't need that. They could have come up with something else. Like, that just seems like a overpriced visual shot that they could have omitted and then used the money for something else.
I will say one thing I liked about the Brooks Brothers line, though, is that I think it does. The problem is it feels so out of context in that scene. Like, it feels so, because it just comes out of nowhere. So it just feels so forced in that. But I do like it because it does make me realize that, oh wait, Shawan Khan's a guy who actually does understand the modern world, because it's too much. He's in these elaborate costumes and all that, and it feels like he's been sleeping in the coffin for like the past 50 years or something. So in that aspect, I did like that. I did like it because of that. It gave him more of a connection to the real world, to the modern world.
Sure. But then, I mean, it begs the question. I mean, if he knows what's going on, why travel around in a coffin?
That's the problem with it, right? You have all this other stuff there. And also maybe too, like him walking around with in like the robes and stuff when the Navy guy's making fun of him, and or when the Mongol warrior is, I guess, trying to tail Lamont, but he's doing it in full Mongol warrior garb, and nobody
Right.
gives him a second look.
Right. Yeah. That's some ridiculous stuff that you got to go with. I mean, again, I feel like maybe that's just studio stuff. Maybe there's like multiple just sort of alternate takes that they could have gone with. And just the studio came in and they're like, oh, we want this and this and this, and screw your vision. Like, I guess we'll never know. But another thing I can tell you that I feel like is too much and maybe should have been saved for a Shadow sequel, or maybe just not even dealt with at all, is like, I didn't like that the way the Shadow got around was a taxi.
Yeah.
It was too much. And then also the whole Shadow agents, even though I know that's a big part of the radio show, it just didn't work for me. I mean, like maybe like a few people, but it's just, I mean, wouldn't people notice the rings after a while? I guess it's just one of those things that you have to go with. It's sort of like a kind of classic pulp archetype. The Shadow Club that all the kids were, drink your Ovaltine, right? From the A Christmas Story.
Right.
That's Little Orphan Annie. Yeah. But yeah, they could have done without that, I feel like. And I wish they just would have come up with a better way for him to get around. I'm trying to even think like how, see, that's the thing, is that like in the comics and in the radio show, the Shadow just appears because that's what he does. In the scenes when he's in the opening scene, when he's in the taxi with the that Asian guy who he saves at the beginning, like the professor or whatever he is, and the guy's just like sort of sitting there cowering, and he's over there cackling and laughing. It's just weird and awkward. Like,
especially when the cab driver joins in with the cackling. That just felt really
right.
Then it kind of got into the ridiculous territory.
Right. Like, I feel like there was potential for like a really good movie in there, but I think it just got muddled down with studio intervention possibly, or who knows, maybe even like Russell McKay was just like, we need more exploding glass, or he's actually Australian. I should be doing an Australian accent, but yeah, how he loves his exploding glass. And there definitely was a lot in the end, like in the third act there, when they were finally sort of fighting each other. But
I like the idea of the agents, but I don't feel, I think you're right. I don't think like they were really used in the way that they could have been. I mean, for one, the whole idea of the agents seems to be that the Shadow doesn't have to rely on any one person, but they give him the cab driver who knows basically everything about him, which, and like, it would have been one thing if we saw him with different cab drivers each time, or something like that, but to like have it all on one, because I think they wanted him to have like an Alfred type character or something like that.
Yeah, well then why not just give him, well, I guess you would need a Shadow mobile at that point. If I remember correctly, I think there is some kind of vehicle that went with the Shadow action figures. Do you remember those when they came out?
Vaguely, but yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, even though there wasn't a Shadow mobile in the movie, but it's action figures, so you got to have a vehicle or something. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the answer. I mean, they should have just give him a butler or something, and like a black, like souped up Rolls Royce or something, like anything besides a taxi. That's just weird.
So yeah, there was the Shadow Mirage, SX 100, which was like a roadster car, and then there's also the Shadow Night Mist Cycle.
Cycle. I mean, if you ride a motorcycle with a trench coat, won't it get caught in like the spokes or something? I don't know. I guess Batman was able to do it with his cape. Like,
well, yeah, and it's technically not a trench coat, right? Isn't it actually a cape, I think?
Yeah, I think it's both, isn't it? It's a trench coat, or like a really long raincoat with a cloak, more or less. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. But yeah, that was another issue too, is the agents weren't really handled that well. And also Ian McKellen just feels like, because I'm always surprised when I watch this movie and I see Ian McKellen in it, because he feels just so out of place in this movie.
Well, I felt that when I saw Tim Curry, I was like, man,
That
I
too,
completely
yeah.
forgot he was in there. I was
Well, in
like,
fact, the only reason Tim Curry said yes to this movie is because he heard that Ian McKellen was in it.
oh, I thought he said yes because, you know, he was originally supposed to be the Joker in Batman 89. And he was like, oh, I'm not going to miss out on another blockbuster. I mean, but that's just sort of like the story I built up in my head.
No, apparently it was just because he wanted to work with McKellen.
How about that?
But yeah, it just seems like his whole thing, like the whole the absent-minded scientist, I think they took that bit a little bit too far with he doesn't know the difference between red and green type of stuff.
Well, I think he's colorblind is the problem.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And yeah, that was just sort of cheesy. And then the fact that he's also Margot's father, just too many coincidences, as we said before.
And also the bomb chase at the end when they're running away from it or running after it, that whole thing was just, you know, that was taken into Benny Hill territory, I felt.
yeah, I can definitely agree with that.
But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that I had to say about this movie. Mostly, I think it's just kind of a lot of missed potential. And I mean, I think the Shadow is an interesting character, so it would have been, it would be interesting to see, you know, someone who likes these pulp stories go back and revisit this. Not necessarily this incarnation, but redo it or something.
All right, so I just brought up my notes. I mean, you can not use this or not if you want, but there was a few things here that I forgot to mention. Like, you know, usually when you're introduced to an important character, especially in a movie, you know, there's well, I guess, all right. So I guess we were introduced to Shwan Khan when he showed up in his you know, coffin, but then he just magically shows up in the sanctum. Just out of nowhere, in the Shadow's sanctum. He knows exactly where it is and everything. And that was just anticlimactic. I mean, I guess the idea is maybe the Shadow isn't used to dealing with other telepaths, so he didn't bother to put any kind of magical, he didn't hypnotize the whole city like Shwan Khan did to camouflage the hotel. So yeah, I mean, he just magically showed up, and that just felt sort of anticlimactic to me. What else do we have here? I think everything else we covered. I really liked when they revealed the aforementioned hotel, when they were, you know, when he was just looking at it and they showed it. It's a beautiful like design, like the design for the whole city and everything felt great. It felt really, I mean, aside from the fact that it felt like the Universal backlot, I mean, at least it was all real and not CGI, because they didn't really have that back then. And then when they had the, and again, this was sort of cartoony supervillain territory, was when Shwan Khan turns on the rotating floor at the end. Do you remember that?
That was weird.
I was like, he had time to make that rotating floor before the Shadow showed up. Like, yeah, just a lot of stuff that, again, as we said, that you have to roll with. But yeah, like I don't know, like I feel people who are really into the Shadow, they still sort of acknowledge the movie positively for the most part. Like, I mean, I love the Shadow character. I just wish more people could see him the way he's like portrayed in the comics and the radio show, is like, you know, more of a sort of cerebral, you know, almost kind of like a Doctor Strange without magic, if you will, instead of a wannabe Batman.
Yeah. So apparently this is interesting, is that looks like Sam Raimi had gotten a second crack at this. And in 2006, they said that he would, him and Michael Uslan, who produced the Batman movies, were going to be co-producing a new Shadow film. And he said that and Sam Raimi said in 2007, we've got the rights to the Shadow. And then in 2012, the website Shadow Fan said that at San Diego 2012, when Raimi was asked about the status of the Shadow project, he said they hadn't been able to develop a good script, and it wouldn't be produced as planned. But that's the latest I've seen about this. I mean, I'm not sure if he still has the rights or anything like that.
Right. Well, you know that very recently, James Pattinson, I think I'm saying that name right, the author.
Oh,
he
yeah.
released a Shadow novel, but according to the dudes in the Shadow Facebook group, it is not very shadowy in the slightest.
No, I've heard a lot of people complain about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just checking right now.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, James Patterson. It was with
James.
Brian Sitz and James Patterson.
James Pattinson, Robert's dad.
But yeah, I've heard people just say like it is absolutely terrible. I haven't read it, so, and again, I don't have any familiarity, so I have no idea how it compares. But even just like looking at the cover of it, I'm like, it doesn't look. If you know anything about the Shadow, this would not make you think that this has any connection to that.
Yeah, the problem with the Shadow, the reason why, I mean, and I've like thought about this, and again, this is just my own sort of personal hypothesis. Like the reason why Batman is a million times more successful than the Shadow is because the Shadow is very of his time, and he doesn't have a cool logo like Batman does. Like you put that bat signal on anything and people will buy it.
Right.
There's not really a cool Shadow signal, unfortunately. And even like, and if you were to bring the Shadow into 2022, like you were going to make a modern Shadow, like, I could already see it. It would be some dude who wears a hoodie or something. And for that look is so classic. I mean, maybe you could do it where it's so far in the future that look is like popular again. Like you've seen the movie, the animated or the anime Ghost in the Shell, right?
Yeah.
Like if you think about it, like that bad guy in there who's hacking people's ghosts and making it so you can't see him. That's the Shadow, baby.
That's right. That's a good point. There. Yeah.
So, if you wanted to do a far in the future Shadow movie, and you could even say, oh, look, people are wearing those wacky styles from the 50s again. Like, I figure like a cyberpunk Shadow would actually kind of work. And no one can take that idea. That's mine, Steven Honeycutt's copyright, even though I don't own the Shadow in the slightest.
Well, you could always do it for a new concept because it's divorced enough where you wouldn't be accused of copyright violation.
Absolutely. Yeah. You see, now you're thinking like an author there.
Yeah. Okay. But I think that's all we got to say about the Shadow. So Steve, you want to tell people where they can find your stuff?
Sure. Yeah, you can go to at Reptilian Media on Twitter, or check out the Reptilian Media YouTube page where I post the Obscurity Now podcast. Every Sunday, we talk about something weird and forgotten. Originally, we were going to do the Shadow on that show, but since we've already talked about it here, maybe I'll keep that, kick that a little down the current for a while. Yeah, we talked about Mantis there, and we've recently been talking about the reviewing all of the Founding Father Image comics since it's their 30th anniversary. So going through there, we had some pretty big success making fun of Rob Liefeld's art because we also post on TikTok. So we found like him some of his little shortcuts in Youngblood #1, which really went over quite well. So I mean, we're really just there for laughs, but we also try to like throw in some information as well. So at Reptilian Media on YouTube, Twitter, or wherever you get podcasts, and that's where we are. Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for coming on the show. It was an interesting discussion about the Shadow. And yeah, and that does it for this episode. You can find us at superherocine-philes.com is the website, Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And be sure to like and review us on iTunes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. If you enjoy the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels.
Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.